The welcome reception for the new chief of surgery had been going on for 20 minutes when Seren finally gathered the nerve to step off the elevator. She'd been standing in the hallway of the 8th floor, holding a small envelope. Nothing dramatic, just a card she'd spent 4 days rewriting, when she spotted him through the glass partition. Matthias. He was standing at the center of a loose circle of department heads and senior nurses, laughing at something the hospital administrator had said. Someone had just handed him a bottle of something wrapped in gold tissue paper. Another colleague was pressing a welcome basket into his arms. He looked exactly the way she'd imagined he would. Taller now in how he carried himself, silver, threading through his dark hair at the temples. 8 years. Seren told herself she would wait until the crowd thinned. She waited until the last department head had shaken his hand and drifted back toward the charcuterie board. Then she walked forward, slowly, the envelope held in both hands like something fragile. Matthias was setting down his welcome gifts on the side table when he glanced up and noticed her standing nearby. He smiled, the polite, neutral smile of a man who doesn't know your name. "Were you waiting to speak with me?" he asked. Her throat closed. "If it's about the surgical scheduling reorganization, I won't be taking questions until the formal briefing on Monday." He checked his watch. "I should circulate before this wraps up. Thank you for coming." He walked toward the next cluster of people. Seren stood where she was for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then she folded the envelope once and pushed it into her cardigan pocket, and went back to the elevator. On the ride down to the 3rd floor, she pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly through her nose, the way you do when you're determined not to cry, in a hospital corridor. She'd spent 8 years training herself not to feel this, and she was going to keep that record tonight. He didn't know her. That was it. That was the answer she'd spent 8 years suspending herself in hope of learning. And now she had it, and it felt like the bottom of something. Seren had grown up in Kessler Falls, a town of maybe 4,000 people set in the Canadian Shield country north of Sudbury, the kind of place where most people either left or stayed for good, with very little in between. Her parents ran the only hardware store on the main street. Her mother, Margaret, had a talent for keeping every customer's name in her head and asking after their dogs. Her father, Don, had a talent for fixing things other people had given up on. Theirs was a quiet house. Not unhappy, just quiet. Neither of them had gone past high school, and they'd always hoped Seren would do something they couldn't quite picture. Get out, get educated, do something that required a name badge. When Seren was 16, a mobile health clinic came through Kessler Falls for the summer. It was part of a provincial outreach program, and it brought with it a rotating team of medical students and young residents who set up in the old Legion Hall on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They did blood pressure checks, hearing tests, diabetes screenings for the older residents who wouldn't drive themselves 3 hours to the nearest hospital. One of those medical students was Matthias Vance. He was 24, in his 2nd year of residency, and he'd volunteered for the outreach rotation partly out of idealism and partly, Seren later suspected, to escape something back in the city. He rented the upstairs room from old Mr. Dupuis across the road for the 4 months the clinic was running. Seren met him on a Thursday afternoon when she was helping Margaret carry groceries past the Legion Hall. A stack of health pamphlets blew off the folding table outside and scattered across the sidewalk, and Seren chased 3 of them into the road without thinking. Matthias came out the door at the same moment and caught the rest before they hit a puddle. "Good reflexes," he said. She handed him the crumpled ones. He thanked her. She left. She thought about that for 3 days. The clinic needed volunteers to help with intake, writing down names, handing out numbered tickets, explaining the process to people who were nervous or confused. Seren started showing up on Tuesdays. Nobody asked her to. She just appeared. Matthias noticed. He didn't say anything about it for 2 weeks. Then one slow afternoon, when the last appointment had wrapped up early, and the 2 of them were folding up the curtain partitions, he looked over at her and said, "You're here every week." "I don't have anything else on Tuesdays," she told him. He seemed to find that funny, not unkindly. After that, he started talking to her. Not in the way adults sometimes talk to teenagers, carefully, slightly above the actual conversation, but like someone who was genuinely curious what she thought. He asked her what she read, whether she liked school, what she wanted to do with her life. She told him she didn't know. That felt true. "You're good with the older patients," he said one afternoon. "You don't rush them." She hadn't thought about it as a skill. She'd just never been in a hurry. By August, she'd started walking the same route as him in the mornings. Not because he'd invited her, not quite, but because they'd both happened to walk that way enough times that it became a thing they did. Through the back streets, past the grain elevator, down to the creek behind the Lutheran church. He talked about medicine the way Dawn talked about plumbing systems, with a particular love of someone who'd found the exact shape of their own mind in a subject. She listened to things she didn't fully understand, and liked listening to them. Her marks in biology went from a C to an A- that term. Matthias didn't take credit for it. She knew he probably shouldn't, and she also knew that wasn't entirely true. In September, 2 weeks before he was scheduled to leave, he gave her a small gift. It was a brass compass, old, not antique, the kind that had lived in someone's jacket pocket for years. He said a colleague had given it to him when he'd started his residency. He said she should have something that pointed her somewhere useful. She told him she didn't need a compass to get around Kessler Falls. He said that wasn't what he meant. She kept it on her nightstand for the first year. After that, she put it on a chain. His last week came and went. They walked their usual route on Friday morning. He said he'd be back next summer if the program was renewed. She said she'd see him then. Neither of them said what was actually there between them, because she was 16 and he was 24, and some things are better left as what they are, something warm and unnamed that you carry with you afterward like a stone in your chest. He left on a Sunday. On Monday, she found out from Mr. Dupuy that Matthias had gotten a phone call late Saturday night. Dawn's father had collapsed, a cardiac event, and Matthias had driven 4 hours to the hospital before midnight, leaving most of his things behind. Mr. Dupuy passed along a note Matthias had left on the kitchen table. Seren still knew the words. She didn't keep the paper anymore, but the words were still there. I'm sorry I didn't get to say goodbye properly. Take care of yourself. I mean that seriously. M. She waited for a message, an email, something. She checked her phone every morning for the first 3 months, with a consistency that embarrassed her later. Nothing came. 8 years is a long time to do anything quietly. Seren stayed in Kessler Falls through grade 12, then went to Laurentian for nursing. She told herself she'd chosen nursing because of the summer at the clinic, because of the older patients who'd walked through the Legion Hall door nervous and left looking less so. That was true. It was also true that something about Matthias's attention while he worked, the precision of it, the care, had settled into her idea of what a useful life looked like. She graduated, moved to Toronto, took a position at St. David's Medical Center in the surgical nursing unit. She learned quickly, earned the trust of the senior staff, made exactly one close friend at work, a colleague named Joelle who'd trained in Montreal and had an extremely strong opinion about the hospital's drip coffee. Seren had dated now and then, nothing that lasted. She told herself that was fine. She was building a career, she was still young, she wasn't waiting for anyone in particular. She almost believed it. Then, in February, St. David's posted an internal memo announcing the appointment of a new chief of surgery, Dr. Matthias Vance, returning from a decade of advanced surgical training and teaching positions in Edinburgh and Vancouver, effective immediately. Seren read the memo standing at the nurse's station. She read it again. She went into the staff bathroom, sat on the closed lid of the toilet seat for 4 minutes, and breathed. Then she went back to work. She'd thought, somehow, that she would feel ready by the time she saw him. She was not ready. The formal introduction happened at a departmental briefing 3 weeks after he arrived. He came in, shook hands with the unit managers, gave a 10-minute overview of his priorities. Seren sat in the third row and watched him the entire time, and he did not look at her once, not in the recognizing way. In the hallway afterward, she was standing at the water fountain when he walked past. He stopped and asked if she'd been in the briefing. She said yes. He asked for her name. Seren Galloway, she said. 3rd floor surgical nursing. I've been here 4 years. He nodded. Good to meet you, Seren, and kept walking. She stood there until she heard the elevator doors close. That night she came home, sat on her apartment floor with the compass in her hand, the old brass one on its chain, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. She wasn't crying. She was deciding something. She was going to stop waiting. Whatever had lived in her chest for 8 years, she was going to set it down. She told herself that. She almost believed it too. Veronique appeared 2 weeks later. She arrived at the nursing station on a Wednesday afternoon. Heels, structured blazer, the kind of self-assurance that assumed deference as a default, and asked for the chief of surgery's schedule in a voice pitched to Carrie. When the unit coordinator explained that the chief's schedule wasn't managed from third-floor nursing, Veronique's expression shifted. She turned to Seren, who happened to be the nearest person, and said, Can someone call up to his office? Seren said, There's a phone at the main desk in the lobby 1 floor down. I'm not asking about the lobby. I know, Seren said. I'm telling you anyway. Veronique stared at her. The unit coordinator made a small noise that might have been a laugh, hastily converted into a cough. Later, Joelle found Seren refilling her water bottle in the break room and said, That was the chief's fiancée. Word is it's an arrangement through his family. Nobody's confirmed it. Seren said, Okay. Joelle looked at her for a moment. You don't seem surprised. I'm not surprised by anything about that man, Seren said. It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. The breadcrumbs were small, and she tried not to collect them. The first one. A week after the Veronique incident, Matthias stopped by the 3rd floor to drop off a revised protocol binder. He set it on the counter, started to leave, then paused. Where did you say you were from? He asked, not looking at her directly. I didn't, Seren said, but I'm from Kessler Falls, north of Sudbury. Something moved across his face quickly, controlled. Right, he said, I know that area, and left. The second. At a staff reception for a departing department head, Seren was nursing a glass of sparkling water when a hospital board member she didn't know started talking to her in a way that made her progressively more uncomfortable. Standing too close, cutting off her attempts to step back, before she could extract herself, Matthias materialized at her elbow. He didn't make a scene. He simply put himself between her and the board member, said a few quiet words about a meeting he needed to pull Seren into, and steered her toward the other side of the room. Thank you, she said. He said, Don't thank me. There's no meeting. I know, she said. Neither of them said anything else. The third, and the one that undid her, she was at her station, writing up notes, sleeves pushed up because the floor was warm. The compass had swung out from her collar when she leaned forward. Matthias walked past, stopped, looked at it. Not with curiosity, but with recognition, and then looked at her face. Interesting piece, he said. His voice was careful. It was a gift, she said. A long time ago. 8 years. He held her gaze for a moment too long. Then he went into his office and closed the door. She sat very still for 30 seconds. Then she thought, he knows. He has always known. And something in that realization, rather than being the comfort she'd imagined, made her furious in a way she hadn't prepared for. Joelle began to change around then. It was gradual enough that Seren attributed it to stress, or a bad month, the way you excuse the first signs of things you don't want to look at. The small coldnesses, the comments that landed slightly wrong. Joelle started arriving early and leaving late, and asking Seren pointed questions about which patients she'd been assigned, which protocols she'd submitted. 2 weeks before Seren's annual review, which everyone knew was the threshold for a senior nursing coordinator position that had just opened up. Joelle went to the unit director with documentation. She claimed she'd found errors in Seren's patient medication records, systematic ones. Seren found out at 7:30 in the morning when the director asked her to step into her office. She sat across the desk and listened to words like discrepancy and review process and administrative leave pending investigation, and felt the floor go quiet under her. She didn't defend herself loudly. That would have been the wrong move. She said, I'd like to see the records in question. She was given photocopies. She took them home. She sat at her kitchen table that night and went through every page. The errors were real. They were also not hers. The timestamps were off by 3 minutes on each entry, a discrepancy only visible if you knew to look. Someone had accessed her login. Someone who had been watching her workflow long enough to know which records to touch. Seren didn't sleep. She put the compass on the table in front of her and thought. In the morning, she requested a meeting with the IT security administrator and submitted a formal access log request for her account. She hadn't expected Matthias to be the one who moved faster. He called her into his office at noon. She expected another version of the conversation she'd had with the director. She was ready for it. She'd spend the morning building her composure into something load-bearing. What she was not ready for was Matthias sliding a folder across the desk with the full server access logs already printed, her account activity, time-stamped, alongside Joelle's badge swipe records for the nights in question. I initiated the IT review the same morning the director flagged this, he said. She looked at the folder. She looked at him. Why? Because I know who you are, Seren. His voice was quiet. I have always known who you are. The room was very still. She said, then why did you pretend otherwise? For months. He leaned back and looked at the window. Because I'd already made a mess of things by leaving the way I did. And I came back here with an arrangement around me, Veronique, that I hadn't chosen and hadn't managed to extricate myself from yet. I was afraid that if I walked up to you and said, I remember you, you'd think I wanted something I wasn't in a position to offer. I didn't want to be someone who hurt you again. You hurt me more by pretending, she said. I know. The folder sat between them. What happened to your father? She said. It wasn't what she'd meant to say first, but it was the question that had been waiting longest. He told her. The cardiac event had been serious, a bypass, a long recovery, 4 months during which Matthias had barely left the hospital in London, Ontario, where his father was being treated. By the time his father was stable, Matthias was preparing to go abroad for a surgical fellowship, and the envelope with Seren's contact information had been in a jacket he'd left at Mr. Dupuis's. When he called to ask about it, it had already gone in a donation bag. He'd looked for her. Kessler Falls didn't have a great online presence. She had been a teenager with no social media and a common enough last name. I looked for you, he said, for a while, and then I told myself it was better to stop. Was it? She asked. He looked at her directly. No. She thought of the compass, of the card she'd rewritten 4 times before the welcome reception, of 8 years of carrying something she'd told herself she'd put down. Joelle was my friend, she said. I know. I'm sorry. What happens to her? That's up to the hospital's process. But the evidence is unambiguous, he paused. What happens next is also up to you, in a different sense. She understood what he meant. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the parking structure and the city beyond it. Toronto in February, gray and cold and oddly bright where the sun came off the snow. She'd driven past the Lake Ontario waterfront that morning, and the ice had been breaking up along the shore in long, uneven sheets. She said, and Veronique. That was over in October, he said. Before I came back here, she didn't want to be with someone who wasn't fully present, which was fair. I wasn't. A pause. I hadn't been for a long time. Seren turned around. His expression was not the composed, careful expression of the past several months. It looked more the way he'd looked at a folding table in the Kessler Falls Legion Hall, handing her back crumpled pamphlets in the rain. I don't know if I can trust you, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just true. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to do it immediately. That spring was gradual, the way things are when you're not rushing them. They had coffee. They walked. Not the morning route from Kessler Falls, but a route along the waterfront that wasn't the same but rhymed with it. He told her what Edinburgh had been like. She told him what the first 3 years of nursing had been like before she'd found her footing. There were awkward conversations, and there were easy ones, and the proportions slowly shifted. He did not try to collapse 8 years into a few months. She appreciated that more than she could have said. Joelle was dismissed following the investigation. Seren heard about it through the director. She grieved it. The friendship, the version of things where none of it had happened, and then she let it go. Her annual review resulted in the senior coordinator position. Margaret took the news about Matthias with a long pause on the phone, followed by, he's the one from the summer clinic. It wasn't a question. Yes, Seren said. I thought so, Margaret said. You never talked about him the way you'd talk about someone you'd forgotten. Dawn simply said, when do we meet him? He took her back to Kessler Falls in June. The Legion Hall had been renovated into a community resource center since then. The folding tables were long gone. But the wall where the intake table had stood was still the same wall, and they stood beside it for a while without saying much, which was enough. Afterward, they walked past the grain elevator, past the Lutheran church, down to the creek. The water was high from spring runoff, fast and cold-looking. Matthias stopped walking. He turned to face her. He had something in his palm, a new brass compass, small and precise, the kind that had been made to last. I know you already have one, he said. I do, she said. This one points the same direction, he said. I just thought it should be from me. The original one should have been properly from the start. Seren looked at it for a moment. She had spent 8 years holding something that felt too fragile to put down and too heavy to carry, and she had carried it anyway, and here was the other end of it. A man standing beside a creek in June, in the town where she'd grown up, handing her a compass that pointed the same way the first one did. She took it. She held both of them in her palm, the old brass one on its chain, the new one in her hand, and the creek ran past, and the trees were fully green after the long winter, and she thought that she would tell this story differently, depending on who was asking. To some people it would be a story about waiting, and to others it would be a story about finding, and to herself, on the days when it mattered most, it would simply be a story about the particular stubbornness of love. The way it keeps pointing in the same direction, even when you've tried your hardest to let it go. She said, "Come on, Mom's expecting us for dinner at 6. He smiled. "You're going to make me explain myself to your dad, aren't you?" "Don has been waiting 8 years to ask you a question or two," she said. "Consider it earned." She started walking back toward the road, and after a moment, Matthias fell into step beside her. That was how it began again, the right way this time with nothing left unsaid.